A very good morning to you all and welcome to Deepwater Baptist Church Online. We've been in lockdown now for 2 months and we've just started to take the first steps towards getting back to normal. Perhaps you've already gone back to work, or perhaps you're making plans to get back to work very soon. Of course, the schools are making plans for how they might reopen soon. And for all of us, we're starting to think about what things might look like as we try to get back to normal. How do you feel about getting back to normal? Is it something you're looking forward to? Is it something that fills you with a little bit of fear? People I speak to have mixed views on that. For me, I think there's some things that I'm looking forward to getting back to, and there's some things that I'd quite happily leave behind, if I'm honest. So here's a challenge for you this morning. What if we didn't go back to normal? What if instead of going back to the way things were before, what if instead we went forward to a new normal? We're now at a point in the UK when we are about to hit the reset button. But as our finger is hovering over that reset button, I'd like to challenge us just to take a minute to think about whether we want to go back to exactly the way things were before, or are there some things that we'd like to be different as we go back to a new normal? Right now, we have a golden opportunity, an opportunity that doesn't come round very often. Perhaps only every 100 years or so we get this chance. But right now, we have an opportunity globally to make a fresh start. And we'll probably never have this opportunity again in our lifetime. The opportunity for things to be different as we go forward. A few weeks ago, Norman spoke to us and he told us not to expect things to be exactly the same when we get back to normal. And he touched on a passage from John 21, when Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, decided that he'd had enough of lockdown and decided to go back to fishing. I'd like to reflect on that passage a little more this morning and reflect on some of the things that had changed for those disciples as they tried to get back to normal. So you'll find it right at the end of John's Gospel, the very last chapter of John's Gospel, chapter 21, and it says this. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. At Deepwater Baptist Church, we looked at this passage at the very start of the year, our first service in the year. And at that point, I said that this year would be different. Well, we hadn't anticipated at that point just how different this year was going to be for all of us. At that time, we compared this passage to a very similar passage that means a lot to us at Deepwater Baptist Church, a passage in Luke chapter 5. They're both stories of when the disciples went out to fish. On both occasions, they have a frustrating night when they catch nothing all night. And on both occasions, when they listen to Jesus, they have a miraculous catch that they struggle to handle. So you could be forgiven for thinking that these 2 passages are in actual fact the same story, but they're not. There's actually 3 years difference between these 2 stories. And in that time, a lot of things have changed. the disciples are being prepared now for a new normal. And I'd just like to reflect with you a little bit on what some of those changes are and the significance that they have. So first of all, this time, the disciples are all in the same boat. 3 years previous, when Jesus first met those disciples, they were fishing partners. They went out in 2 boats to fish. But now John makes a point of telling us that all the disciples were together and they all go out in 1 boat. During the lockdown, we've all been in the same boat. Prior to lockdown, we all did our own thing, we got on with our own lives. But what I think was really great at the start of lockdown was that sense of unity that we had, that everyone was in the same boat, that we were all in it together. We were helping each other out to get through it. And now that we're starting to come out of lockdown, wouldn't it be great if we held on to that feeling of community spirit that we've had, if we held on to the unity that we've had amongst us during lockdown? That same sense that as we move forward into a new normal, that sense of us all pulling together and all on the same side, it would be great if we can maintain all being in the same boat together. Secondly, this time Jesus is not in the boat with them. Now that might sound a shocking thing for a pastor to point out, but there's an important difference here. If you read the text carefully, you'll see that this time Jesus isn't in the boat, but he's on the shore, calling to them. And this, I think, is a significant moment of transition for these disciples. Up until now, if you look in the Gospels, up until now, the disciples had observed Jesus at close quarters. They'd been involved in some of the work that Jesus did, but largely Jesus did the work whilst the disciples assisted Jesus in that work. But now as we move forward into the book of Acts and beyond into the New Testament, you'll see that the disciples take the lead role and Jesus assists them in the work that he calls them to do. So there's a very significant transition here. Previously, Jesus had done the work and the disciples had assisted him in that work. But now Jesus is calling them to take the reins and calling them to do his work. And he promises that as they do, he will always be with them in that work. But he expects them now to take the reins and to move things forward. In the first stage of lockdown, the government gave us very clear advice to stay at home. In this second stage of lockdown, it's been a little more frustrating for many people as we've been asked to think for ourselves a little bit more about what's sensible to do and what isn't sensible to do. And as frustrating as that is, I think Jesus asks his church to do a similar thing. We might get frustrated sometimes thinking that we've been waiting on God to act for so long. But perhaps God is at times frustrated with us because he's been waiting for us to act. The disciples needed to learn the difference between doing the work of Jesus and Jesus doing all the work. Jesus wants to involve us in his work. And it's a real privilege, it's a real blessing to be involved in the work of Jesus. Jesus wants you to be involved in his work, but he won't force you. You can choose if you want to, not to get involved, but you will miss out on the blessing that comes from working with Jesus. Of course, we are still in partnership with God, and that's very important to remember. We're not supposed to go off and do our own thing. But these disciples needed to listen to Jesus' instructions, perhaps more carefully than they had before, as he called to them from a distance. But he wasn't going to do the work for them. They needed to listen carefully to his instructions and do as he asked them to do. And perhaps we need to do the same. Thirdly and finally, they were still fishing this time, but they were fishing in the wrong place. 3 years earlier, when Jesus had met them, he met a group of fishermen who had given up on fishing. They were sat on the beach washing their nets. This time, they seemed to have a bit more sticking power. They hadn't given up yet, even though they'd been fishing all night and caught nothing. They were still going. So there's a slight change here. But they were fishing in the wrong place. Sometimes we spend all our time and energy on the wrong things, don't we? And during lockdown, we may have realised that some of the things that we spent a lot of our time and energy on were actually not that important after all. And maybe we've realised the importance and the value of some of those things that we have spent time on during lockdown. Wouldn't it be great if after lockdown we remembered those things that are of real value and spent time and energy on those things instead of the things that we spent time on before? Because when these disciples fished in the right place, it was easy, it was fruitful, and it seems that they had a big catch in 5 minutes. So what is God calling us to change as we go forward to the new normal? What will the new normal look like for us? I think if we remember that we're all in the same boat together and hold on to that unity that we've had, if we step out in faith to do the work of Jesus that he's calling us to do, listening carefully to his voice, and if we put our time and energy into the right things, those things that are worthwhile and fruitful, then I think the new normal could be an exciting place to be. Until then, keep safe, and God bless you all.